Did I nail it on the head? Hey, here's my prediction. Actually, no, we're sticking with that. Here's my prediction.
Ladies, gentlemen, and those with the good sense to do away with the whole notion, I welcome you to the premier audio medium for all your Fazbear entertainment needs. The Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast. Note, FFPP is not responsible for any loss of appetite, disinterest, dismemberment, or other legally classified statuses. So strap in and enjoy.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast, where I'm your host with the toast, Ryan Toast, here to talk about Five Nights at Freddy's, like we always do. And I am very tired. It is very early, so there's going to be a bit more of a laid-back one. So, if you needed to, at this point, sleep, feel free. I wish I could. But, the horrors persist, and so do we. But you're not here to hear me talk about how tired I am. You're here to hear me talk about Five Nights at Freddy's. So let's do just that. I don't have a topic today, so we're just going to go straight into questions. I made sure to grab as many as I could to still fill out the time properly. If you want your questions answered on the podcast, feel free to send them into Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast at gmail.com. As in the description, to copy and paste, because it is a pain to type out. Our first question comes from Claire, she, they. I was watching an older podcast video about Into the Pit and had a question. What if the sixth MCI victim mentioned in Into the Pit is referencing Oswald's dad? The sixth party hat in the one minigame being hidden away and being dangled by Purple Guy, to me, makes me think of Pit Bonnie dangling Oswald's dad's life. I'm not sure how to really phrase it. I want to know your thoughts on this, though. Thank you for your question. Honestly, it's a good point. It explains the sixth birthday hat and the sixth victim motif pretty well. There is a problem with it, and we'll get to it. But just thinking about what this is saying, if this sixth party hat were in reference to Oswald's dad, that does make sense. Like you've described, it is separate from the others. It's hidden in essentially a back room in both the arcade game and in Into the Pit. And similarly, like you said, it's being dangled over a pit, literally a pit. So if Oswald's dad is truly just bait to get to Oswald, then the yellow rabbit is essentially dangling Oswald's dad in order to get Oswald to enter the pit. So it like quite literally is a sixth victim being held as bait to get somebody into a pit. That's pretty good, right? However, this is not the only allusion to six victims we get in Into the Pit, which kind of is where this falls a little bit. That being, if you look very closely at the picture we see at the beginning of Into the Pit that shows the MCI victims in the shadows, it does appear like there's six kids there. It looks as though there are six victims. Is that true? Who knows? It's hard to tell. It's up to interpretation. But if that's true, then the sixth birthday hat nearly has to be that sixth victim. Does that explain who the sixth victim is? No. Maybe it is supposed to be in reference to Charlie, and Charlie's just being lumped in because Charlie was similarly killed at the same location, if that's what's being implied here. But the picture of the MCI victims, at least to me, kind of points me in the direction that this sixth victim nearly has to be another child. One that we see in that picture, one that we see in the arcade game, but not Oswald's dad. However, if that's not true, and that image doesn't show a sixth victim, I think then that party hat being Oswald's dad is a really good and clean explanation that doesn't introduce a sixth MCI victim, but does explain what this arcade game is trying to tell us. So I really like that interpretation. I really don't have that much to add to it besides that sounds good, So thank you for your question, Claire, or at least your observation. Our next one comes from Jeremy, he, him. Recently on the podcast, you have brought up the dialogue from Hand Unit that explains that bears would attack pizza delivery trucks before their extinction. This really gave me a crackpot but fun idea I wanted to share. Let's assume that Fazbear is the ones that hunted the bears to extinction because the bears were bad for business. That's a lot of dead bears. Depending on how they died, that's a lot of dead bears around metal. I propose that Fazbear Entertainment hunted down bears with their trucks and melted the trucks down to make Remnant for the pizzaplex, or whatever building was around when bears went extinct. Thank you for your question. It's one of those that, The heavy sigh is not meant to denote annoyance, but like you pointed out yourself. Is this likely? No, not at all. It probably wouldn't even work this way. Is it a funny thought, though? Yeah, kinda. Like, could you imagine if the security breach pizzaplex is being powered by bear remnant, and maybe that's why everything's going wrong and getting aggressive, is because the animatronics are getting tendencies of those bears. It does raise an interesting question if animals can produce remnant. Because the books pretty heavily imply, if not directly state, that remnant needs to be made of, like, conscious memory. And how strong of a memory is needed is unclear, but some people don't, like, there are plenty of people who die in this series that are not turned into remnant and maybe don't even become remnant at all. So if it's a matter of having, like, very, very strong memories, can animals have similarly strong memories? I don't know, because, like, animals are smarter than people give them credit for. Animals are really smart. A lot of people just assume they're kind of just dumb little unthinking, unfeeling beasts, but animals are not only intelligent, but emotionally capable. So if it's just positive emotion, then animal remnant is technically possible. But the problem always comes down to remnant is something that has been talked about several times, but very, very rarely thoroughly explained and investigated, which, for most series and fiction, I think is fine. Because, like, people have this complaint about magic systems a lot, where people don't know, like, in universe, people won't know how magic actually works. They'll just be using it and stuff. And people will be like, well, that doesn't make sense, because, like, you need to have a very direct magic system, and I need to know every single piece of it, or else it's lazy. It's like, well, consider electricity. I live in the world, you live in the world. I know how to use electronic devices like it's my third hand, right? I know so clearly how to use my phone right here. I know how to use this phone as if it were a part of my body. If you gave me all the materials and all the tools and said, create this phone, I couldn't do it in 100 years without getting specific in the moment instructions on how it works. I see magic kind of like that in a lot of these medias, where, yes, people know how to use magic, people can be incredibly talented at controlling magic. That doesn't necessarily mean they need to know how magic works. They just need to know how to use it. So, for most media, I'm fine with that. For FNAF specifically, it does grate my gears a bit, because while, yes, that is true, with how little we do know about Remnant and its creation and its execution, it becomes vague to a point of meaninglessness, right? The idea, like, all of us are fairly certain that Remnant we know for a fact it's some sort of spiritual energy and metal. But the spiritual energy part is so vague that no one can really agree on what part of what book is telling us exactly what it is. Some parts makes it seem like Remnant is literally the soul of somebody. Some parts of some medias makes it seem like it's just the memories of that person living on. There's some media that imply it's a combination of both, because there are dead people trapped in their own memories at certain points. So there's not really a great explanation anywhere in any of the franchise on what makes up Remnant. Which then goes back to the bear question, essentially. The idea that, as like just studying in the real world, we know that bears are emotionally intelligent and have a memory system, can recall things. So by all counts, if Remnant is just based on having any memories, then theoretically you could create bear Remnant. But if it requires intensity, that's when we start running into issues. But the problem with all of it, like I've said, is we don't know. We don't know if it requires intensity. We don't know if it needs a specific setting. We don't know if it needs to be human, if it has to do with the soul, right? Because there's the idea, you always want to, when you talk about Remnant, I think it's useful to remember that Scott Cawthon is a Christian. And that's important. That matters to this context, because his inherent biases, whether or not purposefully, will affect when he writes about afterlives. And this is not to say that if you're Christian, you can't write about ghosts. I'm not trying to say that. Listen to me carefully, because obviously, look at Scott Cawthon. What I'm saying is we all have implicit bias. So when looking through stories, when we're taking authorial intent into the matter, there's two types of authorial intent you need to keep in mind. There's the main one, which is what is the author specifically trying to do here? But there's another authorial intent that is equally important, and that is what does the author's unconscious mind infer about the world around them? So those two things are so important when considering authorial intent in media. Now, I've said this before. Authorial intent is good and useful to try to decipher, but it is never the be-all, end-all. Authorial intent is just another part or aspect of the media. It's as important as what it seems to be implying, what the world around it is telling it is. All of these aspects of a piece of media are important, but none are more or less so. So if the authorial intent is there and we know exactly, like if there's an interview where Scott Cawthon comes out and he says, oh, Remnant is supposed to be just an allegory for heaven and nothing else. Well, it's a bad one, so that doesn't really matter, right? It's one of those things that, like, yes, we'll take it into account. Maybe that'll explain why you said some of these things this way. But at the end of the day, you've created a piece of art, and art is a conversation. It requires somebody to say something and somebody to listen. You can just say your art, and that's fine. Just because nobody is perceiving your art does not mean it's not artistic. It is. But the true essence of art, in my opinion, is the conversation. It is the creator giving it to the receiver. And it's the receiver who sees what the creator has made. So in that conversation, authorial intent is a part of half of the conversation. So how the audience receives the art is, in my opinion, just as important as what the author implied or intended with it. So all this to say, authorial intent is important when considering devolving aspects of a story. So when we go over something like Remnant, Scott Cawthon's authorial intent is important, and it can color what Remnant is supposed to be. Because if we consider this odd science fiction approach to the afterlife, and we take in Scott Cawthon's possible inherent bias, because again, I don't know the guy. Let's not be parasocial about this. I don't know what's in Scott's head, what his opinions on things are, or what his inherent biases necessarily are, but we can make assumptions and work off of them, right? That's just kind of what you have to do when discussing authorial intent. Most of the time, we don't know what the authors actually wanted to say. We have to assume. We have to try to figure that out. So with Scott Cawthon, he is a middle-aged white man from the South who's religious. So there is, whether or not it's intended, there is implicit biases that will feed your afterlife story if you are a white middle-aged man from the South who is religious. That's just a fact. And in FNAF, it seems as though heaven and hell are a part of this world. We have Henry's very good line of, the darkest pit of hell is open wide to swallow you whole, or something like that. Or don't keep the devil waiting, whatever it is. So which then implies that heaven exists in this world as well. And I think that is fairly clear in the way that some spirits move on in this series, where like the whole goal is to be able to move on. They are trapped and they want to move on. Moving on, I think, would imply a happy afterlife, which we can assume to be heaven since hell exists. And again, Scott Cawthon is a middle-aged white man from the South who's very religious. So we have heaven, we have hell, and now we have the stuff in between. The place our story takes place in, the place where ghosts are trapped, the place where murders happen. That's the story in between. But it's also the place where Remnant is formed, and that needs to be addressed. So what is Remnant in a world where heaven and hell exist? Well, I think this is where memory really comes in handy. Because whether or not it's intended, I think Scott's inherent biases lead him away from ghosts specifically. And that's mainly because, as far as I'm aware, traditionally Christianity does not believe in ghosts. When you die, you go to heaven or hell immediately. And ghostly apparitions are explained by demons or angels intervening in the world, right? Like that would be, as far as I'm aware, the traditional belief of ghosts in Christianity. So then we look at Scott Cawthon, who is very religious, but is writing this paranormal story. How do we explain this in a way that, doesn't go against everything we believe? Now, to be fair, Again, we're going through authorial intent. We're not trying to be parasocial here. It is totally possible that Scott Cawthon can just separate like this is a fictional story. Ghosts can exist in here. That's totally valid. But when looking at how Remnant has been treated and taking into account possible implicit biases, I think that's why part of this story is shifting so far into Remnant. And that being, Remnant is more memory than anything else. Memories made real. The mind living on. It's a way to have a ghost without the soul of that person remaining on Earth. So that being said, that's why I lean so much into Remnant being more memory than anything. And that's not the only reason. For one, it's literally called Remnant, which is a very memory-coded word, if you will. And for two, it affects other people's memories so strongly, which again tells me this, like souls, why would a soul be able to affect someone's memory versus why wouldn't a sentient memory be able to affect somebody's memory? So, if Remnant is mostly memory, could bears be turned into Remnant en masse? Technically, yes. Bears have memory, bears have, emotions, bears have conscious thoughts. So you, I guess, theoretically could make Remnant out of a bear. But it comes down to we don't know enough about this Remnant. Because if it requires intense memories, maybe a bear doesn't have that intense of a memory. If it requires specific memory, maybe bear memory is more instinct than literal. I don't know. And I don't think there's a way to know. Obviously, you sent this in as a joke, and I think it's insane that I've spent 12 minutes on this question. But it's interesting. It's one of those things that, like, yes, it's not to turn a joke into a lecture like your mom, but it's interesting to take this joke and play with it. To take a thought, like, this is a lot of theory crafting, in my opinion, is taking a thought and whether or not it's likely, playing in that space and seeing what you stumble on. We would have never had this conversation about Remnant being more memory than anything if we didn't take the silly idea of Fazbear hunting down bears and converting them into Remnant as something to play with. But because we took the time and we played with it, we found... Well, we didn't find, but we had a very good discussion on Remnant and the authorial implicit bias behind it. So, thank you for your question, Jeremy. As silly as it is, it gave me some space to play. Our next question comes from Sophie, she, her. I was watching one about the Candy Cadet stories when something clicked. The one about the witch luring the woman is the one I want to analyze. With Fiona being depicted as a witch in Moon.exe, could this be evidence that M1 has influence on Vanessa? I like the parallels and I like the idea of the two of them working together. What do you think? It's an interesting parallel to be sure. Because it's one of those things that, like, if there wasn't such a strong connection here, I would hesitate to say that M1 is being referenced at all in Candy Cadet. Because in that story, the woman goes after the witch and is left scarred, and then she comes back later aged and is tricked by a boy and is then eaten by the witch. There are a couple things that happen in FNAF that fit that story. Nothing M1 does, as far as I'm aware, fits that story, and that has me hesitate. But you're right to call out, and I think it does need to be addressed, the idea that this story is about a witch who lives in the woods, and then in Moon.exe, we see Sun being depicted as an old woman, witch-adjacent character living in a hut in the middle of the woods. Like, that's back-to-back. That's literally back-to-back. The Help Wanted 2 came out, and then this came out. Help Wanted 2 has a teaser about this game. This is too close and too similar to be a coincidence, I think. Right? Like, these games were released one after the other. And the first game refers to a witch who lives alone in the woods. And the very next game, in the Easter egg ending, shows us a witch living alone in the woods. If this wasn't on purpose, it's incredibly irresponsible by Stewell and Scott. But I think it has to be because of that fact. So then what's happening here? Because we look at what happens in Moon.exe, and M1 does cook and eat the owl to give you the owl mask. And in the Candy Cadet story, the witch eats the woman when she comes back to fight her and uses a little boy to trick her. So I was going to say, how interesting is it then that in the story, it's a woman and a little boy who are working together. And what are M1 and M2 besides a woman and a little boy, who don't seem to be working together by the time of the game, but that's just during Siege of the Mimic. We don't know what happens before or after. So again, there's this such a strong parallel between the idea of M1 and even M2 to an extent being this old woman and little boy who are tricking people to falling for their trap. There's one major problem with that, though, and that's that in this scenario, if M1 is meant to be the witch and if M2 is meant to be the boy, who the hell is the woman? The woman who escaped when they were young but was left scarred and came back when they were old and ultimately lost. Because I love the ID's fantasy explanation for this story, that this is referring to Jeremy Help Wanted, that he encountered Glitchtrap in the first Help Wanted game and escaped but left scarred, aka the paper slicer he used to get the headset off. He didn't die, he just gashed himself pretty bad or something like that. And then later in life, Jeremy Help Wanted goes to the pizzaplex to try to stop this going on and is tricked instead by Helpy and ultimately dies. The idea of going after the witch, but the little boy interrupts and says, "I'll help," and then distracts you enough so that you can become the witch's meal. So I like ID's fantasy interpretation of this a lot, because that does match up really similarly if Jeremy Help Wanted is Cassie's dad, is Help Wanted 2 protagonist. That lines up incredibly well. But again, in the very, very next game, we have an old woman who lives alone in the woods who has a son. But there's no good woman character. There's not a single good, or not even necessarily like a female character, but like a character to be the woman in this story. We don't have one of those. I gotta stand up. I'm barely keeping my eyes open. I told you it's a sleepy day. So if we had a good character to be that, then I would be more inclined to believe it. You know, maybe it's Arnold, and maybe Arnold survived the car crash and went back to try to stop it and dies, and maybe that's what the DLC is. Did I nail it on the head? Hey, here's my prediction. Actually, no, we're sticking with that. Here's my prediction. The Secret of the Mimic DLC is going to be after the second ending, the car crash ending. And Arnold survived the crash and is going to go back to the MCM building to try to finish the job. But M2, now that he's obtained the data diver, has fixed itself and tricks Arnold into getting all the way in until M1 is able to kill him. This goes against everything I've been saying about M2, but it fits this parallel damn near perfectly. So much so that, like, if it comes out, I'm fine. I'm fine with everything being wrong. I say that like it's news. I've always been fine being wrong. I think something about FNAF theorizing, it's really fun to just come up with a possible idea, and if it's proven wrong, it's like, oh, well, it was a good idea at the time. Right? I think FNAF is a perfect example of being correct at the time, but wrong overall. Because that's kind of all FNAF theorizing is. 9 times out of 10, we were all wrong and we're waiting to see what the new information was. There's a reason why, like, half of FNAF theories have, we were wrong about in the title. I do it. Everyone else does it because we're wrong a lot. And that's the fun part of this. We get to say our best interpretations. And hey, sometimes we're right. I was 10 toes down that the Princess Quest ending of Security Breach was canon from the trailer of Ruin, and then Ruin came out and did nothing but back that claim. I still think Princess Quest ending is canon from Security Breach for those reasons, and I felt very justified in doing so. But, you know, I want to say at least a third of my videos have we were wrong about or I was wrong about in the title, and that's for a reason, because we get stuff wrong a lot. But that's just what FNAF theorizing is. You take your shot, and maybe you're correct today, and maybe you're wrong tomorrow, but the process of getting there is what makes everything worth it. The process of using your brain, piecing things together, and thinking about it makes everything worth it. It is so fun to lock in and try to decipher. But thank you for your question, Sophie. Our next question comes from Halix, he, him. I've been keeping up with your theories, and I had a question about Springer Trap / Mimic Custody. We know M1 was in the Fiona Mexis, and we know M2 was in the Mimic Endo. There's a theory they swapped, but we would still know where they are. So if Malhare / Glitchtrap is M3, then where was it between its creation after Secret of the Mimic and its VR birth in Help Wanted? The only place I could think of is the chip Baby had in Sister location, Perhaps William thought the safest place for his backup plan for immortality was guarded by his immortal daughter in his secret lab. Michael could have even been sent down to get it to put William's pieces together. I like where head's at, Alex, and thank you for your question. But I will say, I think I like the green chip idea, especially since we saw it in Helpy's head. But I think I like the idea that M3 is in the data diver. Because, like, we look at the data diver. It is big, whatever it is, it's capable of containing mimic schematics. So I mentioned it briefly, but I think if M3 is to be put into Help Wanted, you have to think about what did they scan into Help Wanted? We were told it's a bunch of old junk tech, and they don't even know what it really is, but they're scanning it in to try to get any coding information on how to better program these animatronics, which sounds like a mimic schematic to me. So clearly, the data diver can hold on to one. And then you look at if mimic custody is true, what does the timeline look like? Well, William Afton is working on M3 while M1 and M2 are waiting around. I think he's doing that on the data diver. I think it's a matter of, let me take these mimic schematics with me, go back to my secret base, and find out what makes them tick. So I'll be fully focused on just that data diver until I crack what this mimic schematics are. And then the mimic schematics become M3. So now we have vintage tech that no one really knows what it does, and as a bonus, it's probably the easiest Fazbear tech possible to scan into a VR game. Right? Like, what are we talking about? It's not like it's like a room-wide scanner. You put an animatronic in, the animatronic just like is gone and suddenly appears in your game. But if we're just scanning technology to like glean coding off of it, I guess, which is not how it works, but whatever. A data diver seems like a perfect size for that. Something that you can just quickly scan in and delve into it to try to see what makes it tick. So I think M3 being the data diver makes the most sense. That's my thoughts on that. But thank you for your question. Forgimus Prime. Next question comes from Forgimus Prime. He, him. I like to think I understand the mechanics of Remnant in FNAF, but there's one thing I've been overturning in my head. Why does overheating neutralize the effects of Remnant when heat is a key component in making it usable in the first place? That almost seems counterintuitive. Thank you for your question, Forgimus. I think it actually makes perfect sense. I think you're wrong and stupid now. Forgimus is a regular to the streams. He knows I'm just fucking with him. But if we think about what Remnant is, right? It's soul and metal. Heating, I think it's less that heating neutralizes the effect of Remnant. I think it's more so that heating softens metal. And the softer the metal becomes, it might be harder for the Remnant to stay within it. I don't think we're literally burning away Remnant. I think we're ruining the structure that holds Remnant together. Because again, Remnant is two parts. It's the memory / soul of somebody and the metal. So if you make the metal too malleable to use, suddenly that like first part has nothing to hold on to and would move on, theoretically. So when thinking about heating neutralizing the effects of Remnant, I don't think, and it's a bit of a tricky wording here because it's unclear, but while it can be interpreted as the Remnant itself is less effective when hot, I think it makes much more sense that what this is telling us is that when you heat this metal, it becomes so loose that the Remnant has trouble keeping up and holding on to it. So the Remnant is freed from the metal because of this, which again goes into the final note that overheating may render the effects of Remnant might take away the effects permanently, which to me says the metal was so loose that the Remnant is fully gone, and once it's fully gone, it moves on. So when I think about so to answer your question as directly and cleanly as I can, I think overheating neutralizes the effect of Remnant because Remnant is soul and metal. And the metal is what's being made so loose that the soul has nothing to hold on to and therefore cannot control it. Which is why I think it's intuitive that it works that way. But thank you for your question. God, I just realized we spent almost 13 minutes talking about Remnant on the bear question. And then later on the same podcast, I get just a straight up Remnant question. And I only took like 2 to 3 minutes on it. Some days, dude. Some days. Our next question comes from Snow, she, her. Why would Henry ask Edwin to change the springlocks? Is it possible that this happened after a springlock accident, like maybe the crying child's? It might be impossible for the timeline if this was, but it might be impossible for the timeline though if this was the case, as I feel like it's an odd detail in the game. How would this affect the whole timeline? So first of all, it could not be in response to the crying child. We're almost definitively have information that the crying child got bit in 1983, and this game takes place in 1979. So it cannot. Unless they're retconning when the bite happens, but that's a huge thing that would need to be addressed, not just teased like this. So it comes down to, why would Henry ask Edwin to change the spring locks? I think there's two main possibilities. Either this was just another strategy to get MCM shut down, or something did happen, right? So the first one, I think, is the most likely one. The idea that William was already trying to get MCM shut down, and I think that's why all the change requests were made when the project was getting close to done. Like, they were waiting until they fucked up the most amount of time and the most amount of money of MCM possible. And in a similar vein, changing the spring locks is a lot of time and a lot of money that MCM probably just doesn't have at this point. It's more resources wasted from an already dying company, a company that cannot afford to be wasting resources. And suddenly they have to change all of their spring locks, all of their prototypes. The contract they didn't even get to finish needs to be fully changed. It would be another nail in the coffin for MCM. So that's possibility number one. Possibility number two is maybe there was an accident. I mean, they're spring lock suits after all, right? Like, we know they're dangerous. We know people have died just from using them, let alone being bit by them, right? So the idea that spring locks are so dangerous that they need to be changed makes sense. It's kind of crazy that Edwin is like, why does he want us to change them? Just have a teenager use them. Is Edwin implying that it's okay to kill a teenager, right? Like, these things are incredibly dangerous. I think, like, I hope the implication is that teenagers are smaller, so they trigger the spring locks way less. And we have a feeling that the spring lock suits at MCM were maybe safer than the ones we hear about at Fredbear's Family Diner. Because, like, for all intents and purposes, Arnold falls several stories in rubble within a spring lock suit, and it didn't kill him. It, frankly, kept him safe. So clearly, MCM is capable of creating safe spring lock suits. So I think the first explanation is most likely the idea that it's just another way to waste money and time out of an already dying company. But there is the possibility that there was an accident. Do not leave that out. But thank you for your question. Our next one comes from Flotoon, him. I was wondering what you think the reception of FNAF is outside the main fanbase. Freddy is on a Fanta, and there's the attraction at Universal Orlando. I've seen FNAF in the wild a lot more often. Is Freddy now a mainstream horror icon? I think Freddy has been a mainstream horror icon for the past couple years. I think this is definitely the year where, more than ever, FNAF is everywhere. And I think the movie is a big part of that. Because I think since Security Breach, FNAF has been generally a household name for anybody who has, like, at least a middle schooler in their house. But that being said, it still wasn't as mainstream as it is now. And I think the only difference is the movie. Because, like, at the end of the day, as popular as FNAF gets, it's a game. And even though I think everybody plays video games, and I'm sure everyone who watches this podcast is like, yeah, everybody plays video games, it is not something that everybody does. Especially indie horror games on PC only. You know, like, sure, they've come out on console by now, but when it first came out, like, that was a very niche, specific thing for compared to the general public, not just people on the internet, right? So, for a time, even after Security Breach, I think it was still more of like, oh, horror fans like it and some gaming fans like it, but it's not like a main world topic. I think the movie changed that. The movie was received incredibly well, it was watched a lot, and being a movie, to a lot of people, legitimizes it. Now, I don't think being a movie does legitimize it. I think existing is what makes it legitimate. But in the same vein that some people think that cartoons are made for children, some people think video games are made for children and teenagers. Like, people are like, oh, it's just a video game. We don't have to pay attention to it. It's not real. It's not art. Don't give it any light of day. There are people like that. and then giving it a real live action movie with Josh Hutcherson, with Matthew Lillard, with like all these big name actors, and doing a full-fledged movie. To a lot of people, that was the first time FNAF became a legitimate horror thing. Up until then, it's just been a game that some people play. So even if I don't agree with that, that's the logic, right? And I don't think it's any accident that after the movie, we're now getting Freddy on a Fanta can. Universal, and part of that is that Universal produced the movie, like paid for it, rather, you know? So there's that too, but like we get the Freddy attraction at Universal. We get FNAF and Dead by Daylight. We get backpacks everywhere with kids wearing it. We get FNAF plushies in every store, right? It is becoming more legitimate in the eyes of the public, and I do think the big moment for it was the movie, because so many people watched it, because the majority of people enjoyed it. They thought it was a good movie, right? It now is this mainstream horror icon, which is really inspirational, right? Like, I can't get over the fact that conceptually, this is a story out of a fairy tale. A guy who just wants to make games and is not getting received well, and then takes the mean and harsh criticism that he's been receiving and goes, fine, I'll lean into it, and releases a fluke, a flash in the pan of one last hurrah before I go back and fully focus on getting a better real job. Let me just go all in on making this random game. I'll put it out there for a couple bucks and I'll call it a day. And 11 years later, that character is on soda cans in stores across the country. It has its dedicated attractions at Universal Orlando. Its second feature film is coming out this year. That is a dream a lot of us can only hope to achieve. So it is truly inspirational that something with such a humble and last-ditch beginning has grown to this size. And it's crazy to me. But I think the reception of FNAF now is bigger and warmer than it has ever been. Even in the gaming space. Like, if we talk about inside the fandom, Secret of the Mimic, sure, it seems like a good amount of people didn't like the gameplay. I thought the gameplay was fine. But I keep hearing more and more some people didn't like the gameplay. The vibe of Secret of the Mimic is inarguable. People are head over heels for the way Secret of the Mimic feels and the way it makes you feel, as am I. So, within and without the fandom, I think FNAF has really never been better or bigger, reputation-wise. So, but thank you for your question. Our next one comes from Max, him. I remember the prototype text on Freddy's foot being a big deal in Ruin. After seeing the prototype text on Edwin's Springlock in Secret of the Mimic, the Freddy foot was the first thing that came to mind, but I was surprised how little I saw discussion around this. Why are people not asking, why prototype? Yeah, it's interesting to think about. I think it's mainly because the prototype on Freddy's foot in Ruin had pretty much been settled, and nothing really changed opinion-wise after seeing the prototypes at the R&D pizzeria. Because, yes, they are both a Fred-adjacent character with prototype on them. But I think Glamrock Freddy's prototype is something that was on his original casing that was painted over Toy Story Andy style, right? So, which would explain why in the base game it wasn't there, but in Ruin it is there, right? But just because they're both prototypes, I don't think there's that strong of a connection here. It's written in a different way, it's on a different location, and one is a Fredbear Springlock suit, and one is Glamrock Freddy. However, something that does need to be brought up. It is incredibly important, and needs to be talked about, that the Springlock suits of Secret of the Mimic open and take people in the exact same way that Glamrock chests open. Which I think does lean into the idea that M1's influences throughout this pizzaplex. The idea of like, oh, we need to create a suit. Let me ask our Fazbot and see what it wants to do. And the Fazbot is like, try this design. And it just pulls one of the Springlock designs from Secret of the Mimic, or from Murray's Costume Manor. I think there is a connection there. I think the fact that they're both prototypes can take or leave it. But it's the idea that they both open where the chest splays like this. Right? Like, that's important. And that's something that is unique to these characters. So there is some sort of connection. I'm just not sure what it is. And honestly, with that, I think there's a couple breaks. I hope we've passed the 40. My recording is over an hour because I took a couple breaks because I'm tired. But I think we should be at least around 40 minutes. So we'll call it there. If you have any questions you want answered on the podcast, feel free to send them into Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast at gmail.com. That's in the description to copy and paste because it's a pain to type out. But until next time, as always, you've been watching the Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast, where the pizza abilities are endless. We hope to enjoy your future patronage. Bye-bye for now.